Welcome everybody to the Lunch and Learn for the Pine Tree Amendment. Please introduce yourself in the chat box and your organization. And also we'll be using the chat box for your questions. Sue Inches, who's a steering committee member for the Pine Tree Amendment campaign, is going to be monitoring the chat box for the Q&A session. So welcome. Glad you could come. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Hi, welcome to the Lunch and Learn on the Pine Tree Amendment. We'll get started in just a couple minutes, but in the meantime, if you can introduce yourself in the chat box with your name and organization. And Sue Inches is going to be monitoring that chat box. So that's another place where you can put your questions. We'll be facilitating a Q&A at the end of the presentations. I'm going to give it just another minute for anyone to come. It's a busy time. All right, I'm going to get things started. My name is Andy Burt, and I'm co-coordinator for the Pine Tree Amendment campaign, along with Michelle Henkin of New Harbor. Last December, many of you heard me propose the Pine Tree Amendment to the Environmental Priorities Coalition for its consideration as a priority bill. And since that time, I've had conversations with some of you about the amendment's progress through the legislature. I'm really thrilled in this busy legislative season that you've joined us today for an update and more information about how an environmental rights amendment in the Maine Constitution, the Pine Tree Amendment, could enhance and protect your vital work on behalf of Maine's environment and people. So the agenda for today, could you put that up? Thank you. Is we are going to get an update and overview on the Pine Tree Amendment with Senator Chloe Maxman. Maya Van Rossum, who is the founder of the Green Amendments for the Generations movement, will be giving us how the passage of the PTA will support your organization's work. And then we will have talk a little bit about how the support is growing for the Pine Tree Amendment. And then finally, Q&A with Sue Inches. So I'm very, very pleased to have Senator Chloe Maxman, representing District 13, join us briefly today. Is she here? Has Chloe arrived?
I'm here.
Oh, beautiful. All right, good. She is the primary sponsor who's worked tirelessly to bring together bipartisan support for the PTA, the LD 489. Following Senator Maxman, we will hear from Maya Van Rossum, the Delaware River Keeper for more than 26 years and the founder of the Green Amendments for the Generations movement. Maya and her organization have partnered with us from the beginning, bringing her knowledge and expertise on environmental and constitutional law to our Pine Tree Amendment campaign. So, Chloe, tell us what's going on.
Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. I'm still in the middle of committee, so I won't be able to stay on for the whole thing, but I wanted to hop on the beginning here to say hello. A little bit about why I put in the Pine Tree Amendment. I've been working on climate policy for most of my adult life and have felt really frustrated at how limited in scope it is and how it's often really difficult to integrate an analysis that makes sure that no Mainer is treated unfairly by any form of climate legislation. We've also seen quite clearly in the past couple election cycles from both parties how quickly priorities legislation can change, how laws can be rolled back, and that is a little freaky to me when we know that so much is at stake with the climate crisis and our environment in Maine, upon which our economy relies. So the Pine Tree Amendment is the ultimate backstop. It's our protection. It will make sure that our strong environmental laws stay strong and cannot be undone. So where it stands in the legislature is that we've passed it with a majority in the Senate and the House, which is step number one. Step number two is going to be a 2/3 vote in the House, and then it's going to go for a 2/3 vote in the Senate. We've been working really hard to make sure that this happens because it requires a significant amount of bipartisan support. I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of my Republican counterparts to make sure that we have as good a shot as any on making that happen. In the House Republican caucus, both Representative Fecteau and Representative Fockingham have been really supportive, and we're working to get more folks involved. And in the Senate, there are quite a few Senate Republicans who are on board, and I feel confident about 2/3 in the Senate. So, a lot of this is about obviously passing it in the legislature, but it's also about the incredible grassroots work that has been going on to really talk about this kind of climate policy and how it's so important for Mainers to have these rights forever and for always. So I can stop right there. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thanks, Chloe. Maya?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. You already had a great introduction as to who I am, so I will skip right over that. But I really do want to acknowledge Andy and Michelle and Chloe for their amazing partnership and leadership. They've just been so wonderful to work with. And more importantly, in my mind, they instantly recognize the power and importance of this new pathway for environmental protection, adding environmental rights to the state constitution, and instantly saw how powerful that would be for the state of Maine, and then just jumped right in to do anything and everything necessary to make it happen. So really powerful leaders, powerful partners, and so honored to work with them, and so honored to work with Sue and Rich, Sue Inches and Rich Kilmer, who have also joined the team very proactively, and Carly Woods, very proactive, positive, important leaders who I'm sure you hear from often. And you yourselves have already experienced how powerful they are. So what are we talking about, right? We're talking about adding to Article 1 of the Maine Constitution this language that the people of Maine have the right to a clean and healthy environment, including, but not limited to, oops, I think I used old language, so I'm going to skip right over it. But the idea is to add to the Maine Constitution the right to a clean and healthy environment, and to make sure that all Maine government officials are duty bound to protect these rights for the benefit of present and future generations. Now, the Pine Tree Amendment in Maine is sort of Maine's version of what I call a Green Amendment. And a Green Amendment is a constitutional environmental rights amendment. It's not just any language anywhere in the Constitution, but it is environmental rights language that actually meets a set of basic criteria. Amongst them, and amongst the most important, is that it is language that is placed in the Bill of Rights section of the state constitution. It recognizes and protects the rights of all people, including future generations. It is very clear about the environmental rights that are being protected, things like clean water and clean air and healthy environments. It is self-executing, meaning that it has legal strength and enforceability as soon as the language gets added to the Constitution, and it applies to all levels of government within sort of the Maine state governmental infrastructure, from the local town council up through the legislature and the governor's office. There are some other really important elements to a Green Amendment, but these are the essential elements, and all of them are in Maine's Pine Tree Amendment. Now, we do know that Maine already has a lot of really powerful, proactive, positive laws focused on environmental protection. But there are a number of reasons why these laws haven't been able to fully and fairly protect the environment for the benefit of all Mainers. And we're not going to jump into that, but we can see the truth of that just by doing a quick Google search and looking at the headlines. We can see that people are being impacted by contaminated water and contaminated air, by toxic contamination on the landscape. Of course, we're facing a climate crisis, and environmental racism continues to be advanced in Maine and in states across our nation, right? We really do not have true environmental justice for the benefit of all people in this current system of government and protection. So we can see that there's a gap in the law that needs to be filled. And the Maine Pine Tree Amendment can help fill that critical gap. In very short, in the simplest of terms, what a Pine Tree Amendment does is it raises up environmental rights so that they are treated with as much protection and respect and care and power as those other fundamental rights that we hold dear in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So if you just, anytime you have a question about, how might this work? Is this really going to make a difference? Ask yourself, right? How fully and fairly are speech rights and religious freedoms treated by government officials? Does it really make a difference to have a constitutional right to free speech, freedom of the press, private property rights? And I would suggest to you that it does make a difference. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it certainly provides a very powerful legal opportunity for advancing environmental protection. Really quickly, so you know that there are already 2 states, but only 2 states, that have this highest Bill of Rights recognition and protection for the environment. That's Pennsylvania and Montana. But since we started our National Green Amendments for the Generations movement, since I sort of conceived of this idea and started to advance it, at this point, we actually have 13 states that have Green Amendment proposals, environmental rights amendment proposals that have been put forth. But Maine is very much at the forefront. Maine is truly regarded as a real leader when it comes to this pathway of recognizing the inalienable rights of all people to a clean and healthy environment, and giving it proper placement and recognition in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. And I think that that's something to be proud of. And if you've looked at the press headlines, you'll see how powerfully and how respectfully people are talking about Maine because of the movement that is happening, the positive movement that is happening here in the state of Maine. Now, my job is to quickly go over some examples to help all of you environmental leaders working so hard in Maine, to help you perhaps think about the ways that having this Pine Tree Amendment will help you real time, real world in your efforts to protect communities, to protect the environment, to advance environmental justice. So I'm going to do that in two ways. First, I'm going to do it with just some broad strokes principles. And then I'm going to talk about some specific examples of how constitutional environmental rights have made a difference in Pennsylvania and Montana. And hopefully in those examples, you will be able to glean how the Pine Tree Amendment will be helpful to you in your most important work. So broad strokes. As I said, the broadest of strokes is that the Pine Tree Amendment will raise up environmental rights so they are on par with those other human, civil, and political rights we hold dear. And all the powerful, positive ways that those rights are protected through good government decision-making and, when necessary, good court decisions, that all now comes into play for the benefit of the environment and environmental justice. When the Environmental Rights Amendment, the Pine Tree Amendment, is added to the Maine Constitution, it will no longer be enough for government officials to simply say, we've complied with the letter of the laws and the regulations that are on the books here in the state of Maine, that we've checked the boxes in these regulations to say that this, industrial operation is appropriate in this location. Though there will have to be another layer of consideration that comes into play in every government decision, whether it's about permitting or legislating or regulating or otherwise. There'll have to be a look at have we as government officials done the job of ensuring that we are protecting the constitutional rights of the people of Maine to a clean and healthy environment. So it's an additional added sort of overarching level of protection that comes to play. Amongst the things that you get from the Bill of Rights placement in the Constitution is it means that whenever there is a balancing of rights, and in the environmental context, notably, property rights often comes to bear on whether or not a decision allows a project to move forward that might have significant environmental consequences or not. The property rights often comes in. There are claims of takings or suggestions of takings that really influence that decision-making process. And the thing is, there's no counterbalance for the environment because the environment's not in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. It's subservient to, it's lower down. It's actually in Maine, not even there. So when the Pine Tree Amendment adds the right to a clean and healthy environment into the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, it means that whenever there's a decision where environment or where constitutional rights come into play, the right to a clean and healthy environment must be included fairly and fully in that balancing. What it also means is that when government believes that there will be an infringement on the constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment, the government's going to have to take that extra step necessary to justify that knowing infringement. Two of the most notable things that they will have to do is they will have to ensure that there is a clear, compelling state interest at play, and that the government has taken steps to minimize the infringement on the environmental rights in the Constitution. It necessarily means that government officials are going to have to reorient how they engage in their governing process. They're going to, when it comes to the environment, there's going to have to be an intentional effort to prevent pollution and degradation first, not simply fall back to the permitting process that already exists in the laws and the regulations on the books. Informed decision-making is a really powerful part of having a constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment. And for government officials, it means they have to think about the science and the impacts of the decisions that they're about to make before they make them. Environmental justice is incredibly empowered because all people, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, or their socioeconomic status, now has the same constitutional right to a healthy environment. And government officials become constitutionally bound to protect the environmental rights of all people equitably. The goal of a Green Amendment is to get better decisions in the first place. The reality of a Green Amendment is when our government officials get it wrong, people do have access to the courts to try to vindicate their constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment. Now, how has this played out in Pennsylvania and Montana? Well, again, in broad strokes, the constitutional environmental rights amendments in those states have helped prevent new harms that might come down upon the environment and communities. It's helped address existing damaging conditions that are already in play. And when there have been identified gaps in the law, it has helped fill those gaps. So some real examples. One of the most powerful benefits of the Environmental Rights Amendment is that it really strengthens and protects municipal authority. And it does that, two notable examples, though I think one of them I might come up twice, but I'm going to raise it here because it's really important. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there was a piece of legislation that was passed that was very pro-fracking. And in the municipal context, one of the things it did was overrode local zoning and mandated that industrial fracking operations be allowed to happen in every part of every community, and that it was no longer subjected to the same zoning authority that every other industrial operation in the state was subjected to. And so I, on environmental grounds, joined by 7 municipal authorities, challenged that law for a number of reasons. One of them because of this overreach in terms of local zoning. And the Pennsylvania Green Amendment, the Pennsylvania Environmental Rights Amendment, helped us defeat that law as being unconstitutional, at least provisions of the law, including that provision, as being unconstitutional because it usurped the municipal authority and actually mandated them to engage in unconstitutional behavior. So it protected the zoning authority of the community. Recently, a municipality grounded in the Environmental Rights Amendment decided to, early in the process, reject a development project that was going to have devastating consequences for the last little woodlands that existed in a quickly urbanizing landscape. The constitutional obligation to protect environmental rights was important to support that decision making. This was just the law I just talked about, so I'm not gonna speak more to this other than to say, by declaring this pro-fracking law unconstitutional before it was ever implemented, we avoided a whole slew of cascading harms. We didn't have to wait till the harm was inflicted for the courts to be able to recognize that this piece of legislation was an overreach when it came to the environment and municipal authority. And so we were able to stop it before it even started. Recently, an administrative law judge speaking to the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission used the Pennsylvania Environmental Rights Amendment and the recognition of all of the harms on municipalities and school districts and farmers and community groups and historic resources, that there was going to be such an overwhelming level of harm that would have been inflicted if 2 major 230 kilowatt power lines, high transmission lines, were allowed to be constructed, and that high level of environmental harm that was not balanced by a demonstrating need as required by state law convinced the administrative law judge to say this power line should not secure Public Utility Commission approval because there's going to be so much community harm and there is no demonstrated need, and actually use both the Environmental Rights Amendment to standing on its own, but also to help strengthen its interpretation of existing law to reach the conclusion that this power line, which was going to have so much harm on communities, including municipalities, should not be allowed to move forward. It has been used to address the environmental rights amendments in Montana have been used to address problematic permits that were not grounded in a solid review of the science and the facts and the impacts, and where there was a very significant level of environmental harm that was anticipated. The Green Amendment was able to be used by environmental and community organizations to get those permits rescinded or voided. In Montana, that was in the context of very damaging industrial gold mining operations. And there are actually two examples of that. So again, preventing the harm before it started because the government agency didn't do its job in terms of protecting the environment and considering the science and the impacts of the decisions or of the operations that they were deciding to permit. Right now, the Pennsylvania Environmental Rights Amendment is being used to support our efforts to secure cleanup of a highly toxic site that has been contaminated since the mid-1980s. It's known contamination, it's contamination that has been known and recognized by the Pennsylvania State Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Environmental Protection. And while the agency has recognized the supersaturated toxic condition of the site, the dangers to the environment and human health, the fact that there's a spreading pollution plume emanating from the site, inflicting harm on groundwater and surface waters and other environments and putting local residential communities at risk. Rather than act upon that information, the government sat on their hands and did nothing. And in fact, decades later decided to negotiate a sweetheart deal with a developer that would allow development, a residential development of the site while it remained in this contaminated condition. We have used the Environmental Rights Amendment in Pennsylvania to argue that that failure to act to address that serious condition is a violation of the environmental rights of the people. And so far as we've progressed through the courts, the courts have sided with us that this failure to act was in fact a violation of the constitutional duty to protect environmental rights. Just another example, when it came to longwall coal mining, permits were defeated because of the failure of the Department of Environmental Protection to consider the science, the existing conditions, and the cumulative impacts that had been brought forth into the public arena or public process around the permitting decision, and had just sort of set it aside, checked the boxes on the regulations, and issued the permitting. And the court said, no, you have to actually engage in informed decision making. And then just one other, I think, because I don't want to go on too long, one other area where, an environmental rights amendment is very powerful is in filling gaps. So a very notable gap in Maine and in states across the nation is the failure of our states to really protect us from PFAS, PFOA, contamination of our water, of drinking water, of groundwater, of surface water, and it getting into, soils and agriculture as a result. And that's because the states and the federal government, really have done little to nothing, particularly early on, to prevent the harm from PFOA or PFAS. If there had been in place in our states a constitutional environmental rights amendment, if Maine had a constitutional environmental rights amendment at the time when this proposal to use this dangerous contaminant was being put forth by industrial operations, the Pine Tree Amendment could have been used to say, whoa, wait a second. You have to, precautionary principle applies. You have to bring forth the science to demonstrate that this is safe before we will allow you to use this dangerous contaminant. If that hadn't happened years later, when it started to really emerge, how dangerous PFAS and PFOA and PFAS were for our environment, for our communities, for our health and safety, the Pine Tree Amendment, in the absence of existing law or regulations, could have provided the grounding for swifter action sooner by our government officials to clean it up and prevent its ongoing use. So two different ways that it could have been used there. So hopefully those concrete examples just help you imagine how and why a Pine Tree Amendment in the state of Maine could be really beneficial for helping to protect the environment, helping to protect our communities, and helping to protect the authorities of local government officials that are working so hard to protect the environment. So with that, I will end my screen share.
Andy, you are muted.
Thanks. I had pushed unmute and it muted me again. Anyway, thanks so much, Maya, for a really great presentation, and we're going to get to Q&A right away. But we wanted to just put up a few faces of the folks who have been really coming out as strong supporters for our efforts in the legislature and out as public education in the community. So as Chloe mentioned, Representative Justin Fecteau, who has not had an environmental record in the past, has there's something about this. I think it's seeing how it preserves our Maine values has really made a difference. And we have put these up as part of our Instagram outreach to the communities of who's endorsing us. Next slide, please. Senator Rick Bennett, who is also one of the sponsors of the Pine Tree Amendment, along with Senator Russell Black. They're part of what makes this a bipartisan effort. He gave very compelling testimony on the Pine Tree Amendment at the public hearing, and this is part of what he had to say. Next slide, please. We've been right from the beginning. It was really important that we consulted with the tribes here in Maine, as well as with the very active youth who have been championing environmental justice, as we all know. And we were very pleased that Penobscot Nation Tribal Ambassador Molly and Dana testified so compellingly to this. And I think certainly her thoughts that this proposed amendment to the Constitution of Maine would ease in part the place in our spirit that aches when we see desecration and polluting of Mother Earth. I think really touches some of the things that we are all waking up to and becoming very active on. And finally, one more slide. Here is one of the active youth, Jessica Cooper of Norway. She's pictured here with her daughter, Addie. And Addie suffers from a syndrome that is such, not only has she had lots of surgeries and goes to specialty doctors, but it's really important for her to have exercise and clean and healthy food. And so Jess is really jumped on and has been one of our great activists, both among the youth community as well as out in her community and beyond. So let's move on now to Q&A.
Great, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Maya, for a wonderful presentation as well. I'm just seeing right now only one question in the chat, so we'll take that one and then I'll maybe make a few other points. But the question is about, it's from Linda, and it's about how the ecology and the habitat and the ecological systems continue to change. So how can we conserve, protect, and maintain them when we know that they're always changing? So I don't know who wants, maybe Maya, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, so I think that that's a really great question. And the thing is, as with all constitutional rights, the government officials who are trying to rely upon them and the justices in a court action who might be seeking to interpret and apply them are not looking at the rights in a vacuum. So in this case, they're not looking at environmental rights in a vacuum as though we're in a stagnant landscape of 100 years ago or even today. It is really looking at the current dynamics of the environment, the current science, of course, and you know, the evolutions of modern society. And the most important thing is that when government officials and when the courts are taking all of this information into play, they're really looking to advance decisions and decision-making that is environmentally sustainable. And, you know, in fact, one Pennsylvania Chief Justice went to great pains to note, we are not looking to create a stagnant landscape when it comes to environmental protection or economic development. We are simply looking for a path that respects, honors, and protects a clean and healthy environment and the environmental rights of the people, while at the same time, we are trying to advance other societal goals like economic development. Hopefully that's helpful.
Great, great. Thank you, Maya. There's a question about the updated language, and I can answer that by saying not only can we can send that to anyone that would like it, but also if you go to the bill search in the legislature, it is the text of LD 489, and you can see that there. In fact, you can even see all of the testimony that was presented in committee. There were over 40 people testified. Let's see, there looks like another question. Oh yeah, somebody's put it in the chat as well. Thank you for that. Yep. So I'm gonna, while I encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and I'll be watching if additional questions come in. And while I wait for that, I thought I might just make a couple of other points, things that I talked about in my testimony. And I'll start with the fact that over 10 years ago, I was working on a bill called Quality of Place. And the whole concept of this bill was that Maine's economy is based on our natural resource assets. And the bill at the time was basically saying that in any economic development initiative, we had to consider our economic development, our natural resource assets. And so that bill was quite conceptual. It was difficult to pass, but it did pass. But then the very next year, under the LePage administration, the entire thing was repealed. So we'd had this whole Quality of Place Council and a whole initiative to include our natural resources in any development projects, and then it completely changed and it was repealed. And the reason I bring this up is because that's one of the reasons why we need a constitutional amendment, because it's not easy to change that. Once you have something enshrined in the Constitution, it pretty much stays. And it's a long process to put something into the Constitution, which is why it tends to stay there. And just to quickly review that, the process is it has to pass both the House and the Senate with a 2/3 majority. And that makes it possible to go to citizen referendum. And then there's a referendum held and voters have to approve it by a majority. So that's what it takes to put a amendment into our state constitution. So it's not an easy process, and it shouldn't be an easy process, but it does basically make these rights become basically permanent. So here's a question in the chat. Oh yes, so do the Montana or Pennsylvania amendments have the same conserve, protect, and maintain language in them? And has that been court tested? And there's an additional addendum to that question saying, I'm imagining beach property owners requiring their municipalities to maintain their beachfronts when they disappear due to sea level rise as an example of the change. So that question, and here we have the language on the screen.
So let me just speak to that. So I put that language up. I'm going to show you both of them. So in Pennsylvania's language, what you will see if you go to the third sentence is it says that as trustee of the resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. And so in fact, in the crafting of the language of the Pine Tree Amendment, there was reference to other states, to history, to the lawsuits, to the successful legal actions that we and others have pursued to really try to get the full benefit of the existing landscape legally when it comes to the best constitutional language. And so, yes, in fact, in Pennsylvania, you have the conserve and maintain language. And then in Montana, Montana's Environmental Rights Amendment operates a little bit differently. It has a more basic statement in the Declaration of Rights section of the Constitution that the people have a right to a clean and healthful environment. And then by court interpretation, the language that's lower down in the Constitution, Article 9, is sort of bootstrapped up into that Bill of Rights language to help interpret it and apply it. And there too, you then see about each person, the state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment. There you'll note they talk about individuals as well as the state. We do not have that in Maine. And in fact, a green amendment in that Bill of Rights placement really is focused on government action. And that's what you'll have in Maine. There is no reference to individual action. So I just want to assure people of that. The Pine Tree Amendment is not about lawsuits of neighbor against neighbor. It's really about holding government officials accountable. And that's what the Bill of Rights placement with the specific language we've selected accomplishes. But I also just want to note for you that every state where we have this kind of language advancing, it's all different. It's all different, but you will notice in New Jersey's provision in Section B, it talks about conserve and maintain. Here's Maine. In Vermont, we're talking about conserve and maintain. In West Virginia, we talk about conserve and maintain. In New Mexico, conserve, protect, and maintain. Washington and Oregon are similar to New Mexico. So anyway, I won't go on, but that language in the Pine Tree Amendment is actually reflective of what we have seen to be successful in Pennsylvania and Montana and in court interpretation. And in Pennsylvania, the conserve and maintain language in its context really gets some further refinement and, for example, is supposed to be about preventing unreasonable degradation or diminution of the environment and environmental resources. And so if you actually read the case law, there actually is even additional efforts by the courts to help people understand what it means to conserve and maintain. Like all constitutional language, right? It takes time to fully understand, appreciate, and define it. Right? We've had the rights to free speech and freedom of religion for hundreds of years. And so we have a pretty good sense of what they mean in most contexts, but not every context. We still have some litigation that has to take place at key moments in time. The Pine Tree Amendment, all environmental rights amendments are going to go through that same process. There's going to be a time where we come to learn and understand what it means in this context and that context. And with each decision that happens by government or by the courts, we'll get a better and better understanding of what it means to have a right to a clean and healthy environment in Maine. And we'll be able to build on that over time and fully explore it. But we will be able to turn to Pennsylvania and Montana where there's already been successful interpretation and be able to bring it to bear on what we're doing here in Maine with the Pine Tree Amendment.
That's great, Maya. Are there other questions? I'm not seeing too much more in the chat, but I am certainly open to anyone putting a question in there if they have one. And any other comments from our panelists before we go to the last slide?
So while we're waiting, can I just speak to this question about the property owners, beachfront property owners?
Sure, yeah.
One of the things that we're always going to be looking for in the interpretation and application of the Pine Tree Amendment is really going to be that government action, right? That government action that is allowing for some cases, even perhaps facilitating actions and activities that are going to infringe on the environmental rights that are to be protected by the Pine Tree Amendment. And so in that beachfront property, really the harm that's being inflicted is being inflicted by sea level rise, right? By the sea washing away the sands. We're not seeing in that particular context, the Maine legislature issuing a permit for somebody to come and wash away beachfront lands. Right. So you wouldn't, I would not imagine that there would be a successful case based on that circumstance you're providing, because we don't have the government action or activity there, except when you're looking right in the clean air part of it, right? And that's not going to be this case, but when we're thinking about clean air and when we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about emissions, that's where we are seeing permitting and government actions that might be facilitating air quality issues that are of concern on a number of fronts. And so in that context, you may have a legal challenge, but it's not going to be, linked to the ocean washing away your ocean front. I hope that helps.
Yep. So there is another question saying that I realize this bill would not apply to municipalities, which seems to be an unfortunate omission. And is there a backstory to this? And I would say it actually does apply to municipalities. Any government that permits a project or passes an ordinance or a law that is harmful or that can be proven to be harmful to its citizens, this could be applied. This constitutional amendment to a healthy environment could be applied. So in Maine, I think the most likely scenarios are that that there's some kind of action taken that permits a project, maybe federal permit, maybe state permit, that is harmful. And that, so it would turn out usually that the citizen groups and the municipalities would be able to pursue that issue based on this amendment. So that's the more likely scenario. I mean, I can think of many times where having an amendment like this in place would really have helped. For example, the air emissions from the oil tanks in South Portland. There's an example where citizens have worked really hard to try to mitigate and eliminate those emissions, and having a Pine Tree Amendment to back them up and make the case would have really helped. So there's one example. I think there are other places where there are proposals for mining. And if you have this Pine Tree Amendment in place, it puts the state agencies and the towns, but the state agencies primarily, on notice that they have to take into consideration the public health impacts of a project like this. So I think there are places where projects can be challenged, and also places where projects will be much more thoroughly vetted before they even get the permit, because this amendment is in place. So I hope that's helpful. And maybe, I don't know if you want to add to that, Maya.
Yeah, so Steve, just to really speak to your question about to whom this applies in terms of government officials, right? It's going to apply to all government entities where their authority emanates from the state, right? And so in a municipality, the authority of a municipality emanates from the state. And so that's why this constitutional obligation applies to them. So you can imagine, right, when people are sworn into office, they raise their hand and they swear that they're going to uphold the Constitution. That's part of their responsibilities. And so this protects their authority to fully and fairly implement the Constitution. And that's where that case that I talked about, it was the state legislature sort of overriding their constitutional obligations to protect environmental rights. But at the same time, it does put upon them the duty to respect and protect environmental rights. Now, when it comes to Native American nations, their authority does not emanate from the state, right? That's their authority that they have. Those are their rights that they have as the First Nations of the United States of America, as recognized and have recognized independence. So this constitutional environmental rights amendment, the Pine Tree Amendment, does not place duties, does not override their authority. And so I want to give that understanding and assurance, because that's very important. When you're talking about municipal zoning ordinances, this, right? This comes up very often as a question, like how would an environmental rights amendment impact local zoning? Well, first off, it helps strengthen the right, ability, and duty of government officials to use their zoning authority to protect the rights of the people to a clean and healthy environment. Sometimes people might think about zoning in the environmental justice context, right? And thinking about sort of that red line zoning, where you're consistently trying to actually foist harm on communities of color. And so there you might have a constitutional question that gets brought to bear on the inequity of the treatment. So it's going to play itself out differently in different contexts, but there is going to be a responsibility at the local level to recognize and protect environmental rights. But we also have to recognize and remember that a constitutional challenge is a high bar. So we're not going to be talking about just any action or activity at the local level or in somebody's backyard. It's a high bar, it's a high burden to meet that constitutional violation claim. And so we always want to be mindful of that too when we're thinking about this issue in context.
So a couple of comments on the subject. One example that comes to mind, of course, is the CMP proposed corridor, right? The transmission corridor. And in that case, there are towns where the corridor would pass through them that would prefer not to have that happen. But the power companies, CMP, have the right of eminent domain to build this corridor through those towns. Well, if there's in fact environmental harm, and I'm not saying there is or there isn't, but if there was, the Pine Tree Amendment would give those towns basically a possible way to challenge the project. For example, if, let's say, harmful pesticides were used or herbicides were used to maintain the corridor, and that could be shown to be polluting the groundwater, for example, I mean, there's environmental harm. So I think basically what I'm saying is that this can be a tool for municipalities to use if there is harm coming from something that's affecting their community. So I think to look at it that way is this is a potential tool if there is environmental harm either proposed or going on. The other comment is in the chat, and this is interesting, and maybe Andy can speak more to this than I could, but Maine is unique in its tribal status in that the state government has held the tribes to be similar to municipalities. And so it's a little bit different here than it is in some parts of the country. And in fact, there is a bill that has been proposed and now postponed actually, but to assert tribal rights in a stronger way in Maine than they have been traditionally. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Andy, but this is an issue that's on the table right now here in Maine.
No, I think that really covers it. I know that natural resource management is a piece of that omnibus bill that will be, it's been tabled and will come up in the spring, next year, in 2022. But it is something that, as you point out, is different, that our tribes are viewed and treated much like municipalities. And I know that the environmental community has come out strongly supporting that bill for the tribes to be recognized, for their sovereignty to be recognized by the state. So yeah, things will change.
Yeah. And I'm glad you highlighted that, Steve, too, because I should have delved into that a little bit more. I think what I'll do is at this point, we don't think that this is going to come to play in a problematic way. Although, what Andy's talking about advancing is certainly very important, but we are actually looking into this now and trying to make a fact sheet or an information sheet to help people fully understand the implications in that context. So I'm glad, Steve, that you sort of emphasize that so that I could emphasize that we don't think that there's going to be an issue here, but we are doing the research to make sure that we can fully and fairly solidify that.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for your questions. Great discussion. If we could go to that last slide. As I mentioned, there's quite a long process to amend our state constitution. And one of the reasons we invited organizations to come and be a part of this Lunch and Learn is because we really need your support. And what we're hoping for is that you would sign on as a partner and help us get the word out. We have to get, as I said, a 2/3 majority in the House and Senate in order to put this bill in front of voters. And so we need people to contact legislators and tell them that you support the Pine Tree Amendment. So we really do need help with this. And so we hope you'll sign on. And I also would say that if you have further questions or would like to have more discussion, we are absolutely happy to speak with you individually or even come and speak to the members of your group. So we're very much out there and willing to engage with you and be happy to do that. So thanks again. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's been great to see you all here and hear your questions. And we look forward to working with all of you going forward as we pass this bill.
So Linda, there is a way for individuals to support. If you go to the pinetreeamendment.org and mainforthegenerations.org, in both places, you'll find ways for individuals to engage. So we're definitely looking for organization support, but you had asked about individuals, and absolutely 100%, this is going to take the cooperation of everybody. So I hope that you'll go to those two websites and look at the many opportunities, things you can sign on for, and ways that you can work with our coalition to write your legislators and support the advancement of the Pine Tree Amendment in Maine.
And I'll mention too that there's many, many ways that you can support this, including writing letters to the editor, including reaching out to your legislator, including donating money to our little fledgling all volunteer organization. So there are many ways to get involved. You can talk to your colleagues. You can, if you're part of an organization, maybe you can add something to your newsletter about this to alert your members. So there's many, many ways that you can support this. Our goal is to get the word out and to try to pass the bill. So you can jump in wherever you are and do the appropriate things to help get people on board. So
One other group that we're eager to have come on board are businesses, both Main Street businesses as well as others, those that perhaps are iconic in Maine, that they sort of represent the Maine brand, if you will, and others. And we're developing a number of media and promotional materials that we are hoping will be out at land trusts, et cetera, so that people who are really thinking about Maine's environment, that this becomes something that they also think about as a way to protect the environment, a strategy for protecting what they love. Thank you again.
thank you all. And we hope to see you out there communicating with us. Thanks so much.